Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our session on AI and the 2024 elections. My name is Shlomit Wagman, and I would like to welcome you to this session, which is co-hosted by the GETTING-Plurality Research Network, which is part of the Ash Center Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the MIT Media Lab Connection Science team. And we have the absolute honor of hosting today the leaders of both institutions at our session. Today, Danielle Allen and Sandy Pentland, which will be introduced in a couple of minutes. Our goal in this series of workshops that run the entire academic year is to assist policymakers and students in obtaining the most up-to-date knowledge about the impacts of generative AI on society and democracy and support the design of public policy in these fields. Today, we would like to explore one of the hottest topics of the year, the impact of AI on electoral processes. 2024 is a historic year. Globally, more voters than ever in history will head to the polls. Elections will be held in at least 64 countries, reflecting a combined population of about 49% of the people in the world. Adding to that, the emerging AI technologies, which impact the electoral process in so many ways, including the rise of misinformation, deepfake content, fraud, data-driven voter outreach, algorithmic bias, and more. We will cover this topic today from the philosophical, ethical, technical, and legal perspectives, exploring how we can harness AI potential to enhance democratic engagement, enhance ethical and transparent practices that can strengthen the integrity of election while minimizing adverse implications. We will discuss that and more today with our amazing group of speakers. Danielle Allen, Professor of Political Philosophy and Ethics at the Public Policy at Harvard University. Sandy Pentland, Professor of Media Arts and Science at MIT, and Nate Persily, Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. Each speaker will provide a 12-minute presentation, and we will have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A for all the panelists at the end of the session. Please feel free to add your questions into the chat along the way. We will be recording the session and circulate it afterwards. And I would like to thank Sarah Hubert and Robert Mahari, my co-organizer of this session, and hand off the floor to Robert to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shlomit. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Danielle Allen, who is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and the Director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. She's a professor of political philosophy, ethics, and public policy, and also a seasoned nonprofit leader, democracy advocate, tech ethicist, distinguished author, and mom. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you so much, Shlomit. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today. This is an important topic of great concern to people everywhere. A recent poll reveals, many polls actually have come out recently just showing how high the anxiety is in the general public about the impact of artificial intelligence on our elections. Let me just start by sharing a little bit more about myself and reflecting a little bit on how much anxiety we have had about our elections for a while now. So I am a professor of political philosophy and public policy. I'm also a democracy advocate externally to the university. And in general, when people ask me what I work on, my answer is simply democracy, past, present, and future. No question mark on the end of that list as far as I'm concerned. I have been concerned about the health and resilience of our democratic institutions for quite some time, about a decade and a half. And my concerns have arisen from the general problems of polarization, the challenges of governance and conditions of rapidly changing technological possibility, and the also challenges stemming from inequality and the challenges reflect sort of divisions in society. Governance structures need ultimately to be able to respond to those divisions. And right now we struggle significantly with that in the US, but also in other societies around the globe. And the impact of technology on those divisions and on polarization has been evident for quite some time. In the US case, for instance, in the early 2000s, there was the real campaign against John Kerry, a campaign of misinformation, the Swift voting campaign, as it was called, that depended on the activation of listservs, email listservs that allowed for coordination among people with more extreme views at a scale that we hadn't been previously used to in the country. Of course, in 2008, in the 07-08 election, the Obama election, there were the rapidly circulating rumors about Barack Obama being a Muslim, et cetera, as if that were a kind of problematic category. But at any rate, I was involved in seeking the origins and source of those and trying to make the case to the world of the media that they couldn't disregard rapidly circulating rumors any longer. At that point in time, in 2007, 2008, the standard position of the media was to say, oh, that's just junk, that's not relevant to the news ecosystem, so we can ignore it. But what was very clear in that 07-08 election was that the circulating emails about Obama were in fact driving changes in poll numbers. So there was a clear and direct impact on misinformation, from misinformation on the opinion spread in the general public. So at any rate, the work that I did at that time was an effort to bring the news media to take seriously the question of misinformation and disinformation, both in order to understand its sources, to understand its impacts, and to figure out how to counteract it. That was a period of time in which the news entity PolitiFact came into existence. PolitiFact made its central activity the job of fact-checking news sources across the board. Their approach to fact-checking became a standard feature of the operations of media and our news ecosystem. But of course, we now live in a world where the capacity to generate misinformation and disinformation absolutely swamps the capacity of fact-checkers. In other words, the tools that we began to develop in the period from 2004 through 2014 are no longer really fit for purpose in contemporary conditions. What exactly are we expecting? What are we likely to see? We already have seen in elections, from primaries in this country to elections abroad, the use of artificial intelligence tools to create far more effective forms of deceptive media, synthetic media that represent candidates, communicating in ways that they themselves would never have communicated, but thereby swaying the public with regard to their understanding of what's happening in the election. We can expect a proliferation of deepfakes of this kind in the months ahead. Of course, as you all know, this is a period of time in which more of the globe is going to the polls for elections than in any other specific year. It's a sort of high watermark for electoral participation. So there are going to be a lot of stress tests of our electoral systems all across the globe. What can we do in these conditions? It seems to me that there are two important questions to focus on. One is the question of how we do handle and respond to misinformation and disinformation. The other is the question of our incentive structures in our electoral system, and whether and how we can adjust incentive systems so that behavior is incentivized in a positive direction, despite the opportunities available through manipulation. So let me speak first to the issue just directly of how we deal with a welter of misinformation and disinformation. It seems to me that there are three important steps that we all need to be taking to protect our capacity to process information through an electoral process. The first is it's just incredibly important that trusted sources of information be identified and reinforced prior to the worst onslaughts of misinformation and disinformation. For example, it will be really important that people have accurate information about polling places, about turnout, about the opportunities to participate. And for that, it really is here in the United States, the offices of secretaries of state at the state level that have the primary responsibility for maintaining clean information. For them to succeed in their work, however, it's important that the general public knows that if they've got any kinds of questions or confusions about the election, a .gov website, and in particular, the .gov website for the Secretary of State's office, should be the place to go. So we need to reinforce the validity of those trusted brokers of information. So .gov websites and Secretary of State's offices need the resources to be able now to message to their constituencies that they are the place to come if there's any confusion about polling places, about election times, about what people's rights to vote are and the like. The Secretary of State's office needs to be the first stop and first response for good information. The second thing, of course, is the question of how to protect ourselves from deep fakes. We live in a world where fundamentally we all now have to assume that any media we encounter is fiction. We have to start with a sort of baseline expectation that what we see is fiction, and then look for the proofs or validations that things aren't fiction, but are actually accurate depictions of reality. Ultimately, this will mean, I think, moving in a direction similar to that in Taiwan, where Taiwan is now providing people, in effect, with licenses so that they can mark media productions as validated and having been produced by authorized producers of media. So a sort of consumer protection certification that you can secure a license, in effect, to produce media from governmental licensing offices. So in Taiwan, in other words, they've already made the policy switch to the notion that the baseline is that things are fiction and that authorized producers of media will have certificates, keys, basically, public keys that they can use to mark their products so that those products can be recognized as valid and certified. In contrast, in the US, we're in a place where we haven't yet made the mental mindset transition to the notion that the baseline is that everything is fiction. Rather, we still look at media and expect that it will be accurate. And so in that regard, we have to begin to protect ourselves by requiring that those who are using artificial media to manipulate campaign materials, in fact, disclose that on those materials. We have disclosure practices for campaign finance. You have to disclose who's funding a particular campaign message. And now we are seeing state laws under consideration this month and next month around the country to require similar disclosure for campaign media produced in the 90 days leading up to the election where artificial intelligence has been used. What this does permit is, of course, then enforcing against those who haven't disclosed when that is identified. And that is an important form of protection. But most of all, what that policy does is start to educate the public to transition their own expectations to the notion that what they're seeing may well be false. That legislation, I think, is a really important advance. The third thing we need to do for the information ecosystem is really to focus on education. Inoculating all of ourselves to the idea that what we'll see is fiction. And the best way to inoculate ourselves, I think, is in fact to teach people digital competence. We all need to learn ourselves how to use these tools to create media products, synthetic media products, fictionalized media products. If we know how to create these things, then we will be much more self-aware that what we are seeing may be such a creation. Now, those are 3 steps we can take about the information ecosystem. Let me switch to the question of incentives in our electoral structure, and I'll be brief on this point. But currently, we actually have choices in our electoral mechanisms that can make a difference for whether or not people are incentivized to generate misinformation and disinformation, or incentivized to generate productive and helpful information. For example, currently, misinformation and disinformation, or negative campaigning, even prior to the most abusive forms of media use, it operates in the US primarily to try to drive turnout down. One of the goals of campaigning is to disincentivize your opponent's voters from turning out. So the point of negative media is to really demoralize your opponent's voters again so they don't come to the polls. A solution to this is actually what exists in Australia and other countries around the globe. Universal voting, a mandatory requirement to participate. That puts the onus on the government actually to ensure that everybody is registered. So it addresses challenges with voter registration. But then even more importantly, campaigns no longer have any incentive to try to reduce turnout. So that should reduce significantly the use of misinformation and disinformation. And it would be an interesting empirical study to look at whether or not states with universal voting requirements do in fact see a lower degree of misinformation and disinformation in their elections in the current cycle. A similar change that affects incentives would be to switch from plurality voting methods to ranked choice voting methods. So in a plurality system, every candidate, or rather every voter can vote for just one candidate, regardless of the number of candidates. And whichever candidate gets the most votes, even if that's not a majority, wins the election. In a ranked choice voting system, in contrast, you vote for your preferences, your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. And nobody wins until they get a majority. So if nobody gets a majority on a first count, you knock out the last choice person, and whoever voted for them has their votes reallocated to their second choice person. And you carry out, in effect, a runoff process until somebody gets over that 50% threshold. Now, the contrast between those two systems is very different incentives for campaigning. On the first model, the goal of campaigning is to divide the electorate. You don't need 50%, you don't need a big coalition, you just need to break up the electorate and then gain the biggest chunk of the electorate. That incentivizes people, again, to negative and divisive campaigning. On the ranked choice voting model, the goal is to get to that 50% plus one threshold. That means you've got to build a coalition. That means you can't demonize your opponent because you actually want to be the second choice of your opponent's voters. And so that incentivizes positive campaigning. And we have seen this difference in municipalities that have adopted ranked choice voting. They've seen a diminishment of negative campaigning. So this is the second pathway to protecting ourselves from the impacts of AI. We can think really hard about our electoral system and make choices for our electoral system that incentivize positive behavior from candidates. That would be another way of protecting ourselves from the forthcoming challenges of artificial intelligence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danielle. We'll be moving to our next speaker, Sandy Pentland, who is my thesis advisor. Professor Pentland directs the MIT Connection Science Group, an MIT-wide initiative, and previously helped create and direct the MIT Media Lab and the Media Lab Asia in India. He's one of the most cited computational scientists in the world, and Forbes declared him one of the 7 most powerful data scientists in the world. He's on the board of the UN Foundation's Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Goals, co-led the World Economic Forum discussions in Davos, that led to the EU privacy regulation GDPR, and was one of the UN Secretary General's data revolutionaries, helping to forge transparency and accountability mechanisms in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Sandy, it's all you.
Okay, good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I should also mention that I'm now a fellow at Stanford High and will be spending a lot of time here, hopefully working with Nate and Eric Bernolson and Condi Rice and people like that. So the question I want to ask is to sort of step back and ask, how did we get here? Okay, this is not a good place. We clearly didn't plan this. And the thing I think I would start with is how the internet was founded. So for the first many years of the internet, it was something that was restricted to people who worked for the government or people who worked for universities. And so there was really no need to vet them or have security because they all had inherited the identity and security mechanisms of the government or the university. And even as the internet sort of became more broadly used, originally it was used mostly by fairly wealthy people, fairly wealthy, tech-savvy people. And so the problems we encountered weren't that large. People wax romantic about the well and old sort of social media. But as everybody joined, that opened the way for adverse attacks by other countries, for crime, for people who make money roughly by alarming the rest of us. And so that gets us to where we are. And the things I see people talking about today are mostly around management of media, detection of deep fakes, checking facts, things like that. And we've been here before. There was a long time when we talked about digital rights management and about matching images and things. And the answer to that has always been there's ways to engineer around it. There's ways to avoid it. And in many cases, it's not from official media, it's from unofficial things, both troll farms and bots, or as they call it in the trade, useful idiots that you promote to be able to get your false message across. And the only thing that's really worked in all these cases is some sort of a reputation mechanism. So, for instance, Danielle mentioned Taiwan. One of the things that Taiwan has is you can be anonymous on digital media, but you're also certified as an actual citizen and a person, a living human, who has the right to comment on things. And interestingly, when you bring that up in the United States, people go, "Oh, you'll never have a digital identity, blah, 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 blah." But in fact, if you look at crypto exchanges, all those people who are the most radical libertarians, crypto exchanges now require that you present a passport or a real ID, which they keep secret. And then they give you a synonymous token, which is your handle, as it were, for doing things. And this is to comply with the travel rule, where you want to be able to trace back fraud to the people that perpetrated the fraud. And that type of mechanism is used in finance for a reason. It's the only thing that has really been fairly successful. And so what we have to do is we have to think about, can we do that in media? And the answer is pretty yes. We have most of the infrastructure there already to do it. If you look at the sort of HTTPS, the S is an authentication certificate that can be used for high quality security, but nobody uses it. And if we sort of began having the sorts of certification, the sort of hidden ID that you see in Taiwan or in the crypto exchanges, that would allow you to identify actors that are misbehaving. Now, people have different definitions of misbehaving, but if you can know the profile of an actor on the web, then you can decide whether you like that or not. So it doesn't remove choice. It doesn't put judgment in the hands of some elite, but it does give you a sense of who it is that you're talking to. Is it a real human? Is it a human who is a citizen of the United States? Is it a person who has been reasonable in the past? And I think that will go a long way towards curing a lot of these things. You say, well, no, you'll never see that on social media. But in fact, things like Nextdoor already do that. They have 80 million customers. Seems like a lot of people like to do that. Taiwan does it. All sorts of places do it. Why don't we do it too? And so that's where I'd sort of like to end, is that, look, there's this sort of radical libertarian, which we have to be completely anonymous. And what that means is that there's no reputation mechanisms, because you can switch names and identifiers just as you want. That is, to me, the root of many of these sorts of problems. The inability to judge the history of a person, to get to know them, and decide for yourself whether you want to trust them or not. And so I would suggest that we have this sort of fairly radical principle of complete anonymity in opposition to the ability to track down bad guys and have some sort of knowledge of who it is that we're dealing with. Those are two values we have in our society, and they collide. And I think the set point today is not quite right, and perhaps we need to change it the way they have in Taiwan, or the way that the crypto bros do. So I'll just end there and suggest that this notion of identity and reputation is a really core thing for getting us out of the place that we're in now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And finally, I'd like to hand it over to Nate Persily, who's a professor of law at Stanford and director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. Nate, all you.
Well, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen and do a little show and tell here. If we have time, I'll also play a few deep fakes. All right, so let me tell you how first of all, thank you so much to everyone, all the organizers of the Ash Center and all the other sponsors. It's a thrill to be with you virtually here at 6:30 a.m. on the West Coast. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about AI in the 2024 election. And AI is one component of a larger set, I think, of election challenges, as Danielle Allen was saying, I think, at the beginning. And so I'm someone who, although I direct the Cyber Policy Center, I work with election officials quite a bit and was the former research director of the President's Commission on Election Administration. And so I'm looking at this not only from the standpoint of, say, the voters, but also the election officials and all other components of the system. And right now, the election infrastructure is quite vulnerable to sort of technological sort of castings of doubt through AI and other means. But you can't think about what's happening in the electoral system without also thinking about what's happening in the tech ecosystem, where there have been, I think, some major changes over the last year that have an impact on the potential for disinformation to have an impact on elections. But ultimately, I am actually more concerned in this election about AI panic than I am about AI itself. But AI panic is a democracy problem, I think, for reasons that Danielle also mentioned in her talk. All right, so first, just to talk about the sort of soft target of the American election infrastructure. Most states have new laws in the last 4 years since the last presidential election. A lot of this has to do with either the COVID adaptations or the responses to those adaptations in the election infrastructure. And we have roughly a third of election officials have resigned over that period. And so we have novice election officials in many places interpreting new laws that may allow for a lot of discretion or vagueness. And these folks are under incredible political and legal scrutiny. A lot of the resignations are in the face of death threats. This is a job that comes with a lot of scrutiny, and given the final feature, which is that there's been this polarization and collapse in confidence in the election infrastructure. And so into this kind of environment of both scrutiny and doubt, we've had also parallel changes in the tech ecosystem. So that if you care about online threats, right now there has been a retreat from trust and safety at the platforms. I think it started with the move of Twitter to X and the firing of a lot of the trust and safety teams there and people who do elections, but it's not limited to Twitter. You've seen this throughout the industry. But what's happened at Twitter is that what had been an equilibrium that regarding content moderation among the platforms has now been sort of blown apart. And Twitter's an important platform also because it was critical for cross-platform collaboration to discuss emerging threats. And so that kind of collaboration has kind of been obliterated here in Silicon Valley with relevance to to how they're going to deal with political content online. And the trust and safety teams have been chastened by both because of mistakes that they made in 2020, like with the Hunter Biden laptop and correlative political pressure, that is now also culminating in a lawsuit that the Supreme Court's going to be hearing this, or has already heard, and will issue a decision relating to the relationship of platforms to the government, whether, as in Florida and Texas, state laws that require platforms to carry all content from candidates, or in Florida's case, journalistic institutions, so that they couldn't enforce disinformation or hate speech or other kinds of policies. All right, so into that soup, we now drop AI. And AI is all around us. In fact, if you go to this link below, you will see a 24-hour debate between avatars of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I warn you, it's sort of not safe for work, most of it. So I got a few clips that were relatively innocuous. So I'll play one here.
You're like a cockroach that just won't die. Now, let's address the brain dead chat.
And in the spirit of bipartisanship, let me do the avatar of Donald Trump. Whoop.
Nate, we cannot see the screen.
Oh, you can't see it? Okay. All right. Can you see it now?
Nope.
Yes, you can see the screen.
Okay. So I was just playing some of the deep fakes that I've collected. So the basic rule for AI and democracy is that it amplifies the abilities of all good and bad actors in the system to achieve all the same goals they've always had. And so it's appropriate that we're being very concerned right now about AI, but to talk about AI and democracy, you have to sort of envision it as being all parts of the entire system, so that good and bad actors are going to be using it. I have a former student who's now developing a company that provides you an AI campaign consultant in a box, and they've made jingles for me for voting for, voting against Nate Persily. So everything that is in any digital product in the election ecosystem is going to have AI in it. And it's no surprise that people are extremely afraid. I mean, as we see with headlines like this coming from the Washington Post. And as Danielle Allen was saying earlier, that there's real concern among the American population. Yesterday, Elon University released these polls about people's concerns about AI and media. And Axios showed that as about even as early as about a year, 10 months ago, that a majority of Americans thought misinformation spread by artificial intelligence would have an impact on who wins. But AI panic is itself a democracy problem, because whatever the percent, the share or the amount of deep fakes that are out there, it's still going to represent a tiny, tiny share of the content that we consume as users. And this is sort of true for most online trust and safety harms, which is that they are what we call a tail problem, right? Small number of producers and a small number of people who get exposed to it. But a lot of our sort of research in disinformation over the last decade, it shows that these things become a problem when they get amplified by responsible outlets and mainstream media. And so that tiny, tiny percent of synthetic media that will be sort of parts of our media diet is then going to cast doubt on the real content that is most of our feed. And this is what leads to what we social scientists call the liar's dividend, which is that the problem with AI and democracy is not just that you might be persuaded by something false, but that the remainder of that content is going to of true content you won't believe, and so it allows elites to then disclaim the truth and say that something actually is a lie. All right, so what's to be done? And some of this has been mentioned already. Amy Klobuchar has 3 bipartisan bills that have seemed that they might have a chance of passing this term. As strange as that might seem, since it's so hard to pass election, let alone tech legislation. The Protect Elections from Deceptive AI Act, AI Transparent Elections Act, and Preparing Election Administrators for AI Act, all of which would deal with the problem of deepfakes in elections from different perspectives. I want to put in a plug for the other piece of legislation that she's co-authored that I was involved in, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which would allow us to learn more about how these technologies are actually being used and how they comprise the content in the social media ecosystem, because it would require social media companies to turn over some data to outside researchers. The platforms, they already have countermeasures for what they call coordinated inauthentic behavior, and many of those can be effective against both deepfakes and disinformation generally, because most of what the platforms have done with respect to disinformation doesn't focus on the content itself, but on the network that spreads the content. And if they were, there's a reason that Facebook takes down 4 billion accounts a year. It's not because those are human accounts, but they're bots and AI sort of affected. They have all the major ones had proposed rules on limiting AI and political advertisements and disclosure of the use of AI in certain settings, which is important, but we need to understand what's actually going on social media. So now is the worst time for them to be closing off API access and other transparency tools. The AI platforms have different obligations, and I think it's appropriate for them to actually take a pretty hard line on the use of their products for campaigning. OpenAI makes ChatGPT has a rule that they will not, you cannot use their products or the API for campaigning or lobbying. But as Danielle Allen was saying earlier, that the AI is in other settings as well, with chatbots that can be used toward good ends by secretaries of state and others who want to provide election information. But we need to make sure that the information in those chatbots is authoritative and accurate. And so I'm encouraged that Anthropic has partnered with Democracy Works and OpenAI has partnered with the National Association of Secretaries of State in order to provide election information from authoritative sources. I think, though, if they are going to have rules against the use of their products for campaigning, they should also ban the use of the products by candidates, parties, super PACs, and 501c4s. But as in everything related to AI, the availability of open platforms is going to make regulation very difficult here because through Llama, as well as the many other open platforms, political actors are going to be able to create synthetic imagery and content. Finally, I think the legacy media needs to avoid unnecessary amplification of these deepfakes, and they also simultaneously, while covering what's dangerous, need to control the urge to panic. And it makes it more important that then they amplify the voices of responsible actors in the system, such as those who are administering our elections. But in the end, look, we've got Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And so this technology that we've developed is going to have effects on our democracy. But I think it's of less significance than these sociological factors that are really causing some problems in both US democracy and around the world.
Thank you so much, Nate. So we'll be moving to the Q&A portion of this webinar. I encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A box. And for the time being, some of you had submitted some questions during registration, so I'll start with those. And these are kind of open questions, so whoever would like to answer them, please feel free. The first question was, should we enact legislation to require easy ways to identify and label the amount of AI-generated material in any publication, production, etc.?
Well, maybe I'll jump in with that first, since I referred to the legislation that's currently making its way through state legislatures. And I do think that that legislation is good and helpful. But I also think that what it is a first step in a transitional period. So let me just describe that transitional period again. Sandy also alluded to this. I think we do need to transition to a place where people have been credentialed to produce media and can then, mark their media with their public key so that the fact that it comes from a validated source is easily discernible by the public. What the current legislation does of requiring that people sort of stamp synthetic media with the fact of that synthetic production is start to accustom us to the notion that there's like a sort of placeholder on the media for gaining information about sources. So over time, I think we will transition from a sort of stamp on synthetic media that says this used artificial intelligence to a stamp that says I am a validated producer of this item of media. So that's the sort of transition we're working through right now, and I do think that legislation to achieve that is helpful.
My attitude about legislation is that you have to be able to enforce it, which means you need people in enforcement who actually track things down and courts to try it, and it just seems when I think about the sort of foreign nations who are doing things, the crime rings that are doing things, they can spin up hundreds of things an hour, right? And so actually tracking them all down and enforcing things seems very difficult without a lot of these sort of root identification thing. So not just that this is a authenticated piece of media, but where did it come from? And if you see lots of things coming from somebody, then that look questionable, then that's a questionable source, which just makes it very, very difficult for people to put out deep fakes, bad information. And this is why it's used in finance, because, yes, fraud is bad. You can prosecute, but you got to catch them and get them in court and do things first. And so having ways to be able to do discovery, which is a reputation mechanism, just seems to be the base thing that will actually begin to work. So that's not a legislation thing. It's a standards thing, right? It doesn't necessarily require governments to act. It requires standard committees to specify that this is the way to do it. And of course, government can require it.
Let me just jump in to say that I think that a lot of the research on disinformation suggests that people are not processing this information in the way that one would process a Lincoln Douglas debate or a court case, right? It's not that they're weighing the truth and falsehood of it, and that ends up being the critical factor. And so, well, I think we need to invest in all these authentication or attestation or digital signature watermarking kinds of technologies, because there are always going to be authoritative sources and responsible journalists that care about it. But we shouldn't be under the impression that the system of authentication is going to significantly address the disinformation problem, because when people are processing content, it's emotional and psychological just as much as it is sort of cognitive. And we know this because even with these shallow fakes that are out there, which would get by any screener, like when they reorganize the January 6th footage so it starts looking like a tourist event or something like that, and let alone other kinds of Adobe photoshopping and decontextualizing photographs, things like that, that it always has, it's going to have an effect on the reader, regardless of the kind of fact-checking institutions that surround it.
Sandy, to just briefly cold call you on this topic, I'm reminded of our colleague Boaz Barak's work on kind of the impossibility of strong watermarking. Could you comment on the technical feasibility of making sure that every piece of synthetic generated content is watermarked, and kind of the removability of that?
I mean, so this is, when there was first digital media, people wanted to get paid for their media, so they came up with digital rights management, which exists in every phone and every device in the world and isn't used by nobody. And the reason is that it's just too easy to get around with. There's lots of ways to get around. I mean, just think about the following. Imagine that you took one of these AI synthesis programs and you said, I want something just like this, but without the watermark. Well, okay, you're going to get stuff like that. It just, I mean, there's all these detailed technical arguments, but the history is that it doesn't work. The only thing that really works is some sort of a reputation mechanism, which requires some sort of identity, which doesn't mean that it's not anonymous. It means that there has to be a way to get back to a root.
Danielle, I think you have a similar perspective on this.
Yes, I just wanted to be clear because I was slightly concerned that people may have misunderstood me. So I'm not making the case that where we're headed is universal watermarking of all content. I'm actually making the case exactly that, as Sandy is, that where we're headed is the reputational certification, and that does require the underlying identity infrastructure. And the point that I was making was that the sort of near-term, short-term effort to watermark in the campaign context last 90 days before an election begins to accustom people to the idea that then you'll use that placeholder watermarking space for the reputational indicator space kind of going forward. So we're in a transition from one to the other, precisely because watermarking universally is not actually a feasible strategy.
Perfect. Thank you all for that. Moving to the next question. And by the way, Gregory Bayer said that this was excellent and we should share our views with a policy brief. So this is a cool thing to do. But the next question from Brian Colombini is what would you say to local election officials who are nervous about AI accelerated misinformation and hoping to learn more about what they can do to defend themselves?
I'll just jump in here. I'm doing actually a webinar next Friday on this at University of Wisconsin with election officials for those who are interested. And the National Conference of State Legislatures and National Association of State Election Directors has some guidance on this, as well as the Election Center, which is specifically a coalition of local government officials. A lot of this, I think, goes to the inoculation points that Danielle was saying early on, and this is true for disinformation generally, that we need to bring in people into these local election offices to show them how the process works, to have greater transparency and all that. It's not going to solve all the problems. Right now, if you deal in this space, you see some pretty dedicated actors who are going to undermine confidence in the election infrastructure. But it's important for each local official to have a plan on how to deal with this. But this is true with respect to disinformation generally. How do you confront false statements about the election process?
If you look at places like Australia and certain other places, I see that local officials conduct local media campaigns, so like on TV, on radio, that emphasize the .gov websites and put out approved statements from the candidates and make that sort of information available, because a lot of people really don't pay much attention to it. You'd still like them to have a judgment. And so if you make it really easy for them to see approved statements and look at where the polling sites are and things like that, through a TV campaign, through a radio campaign, through web campaigns, that can do a lot. And note that TV campaigns can now be extremely local. They can be neighborhood by neighborhood. So you can have your neighborhood polling place popping up on your TV screen or your YouTube screen or something like that.
Danielle, if you don't have anything on this, we'll move to the next one. Perfect. So we've been focusing very much on kind of misinformation and deep fakes. The next question from Dennis Stevens focuses on artificial general intelligence and their ability to participate in and influence electoral processes, and the need or the perceived need to develop legal frameworks that address the personhood status of AGI and provide guardrails around its involvement in elections. He was wondering if anyone had thoughts on AGI.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, I think people should stop using the term because we don't really know what AGI would look like. I mean, my calculator is better at numbers than I am. Does that mean it's an artificial general intelligence? It's not good at other things. And, until they're all embodied and, essentially something that you can't distinguish from a human, the term AGI is a little questionable. It's also the media, the Silicon Valley hype is all around these sort of big models like OpenAI and things like that. I think that real action and the real investment is in adding that type of smarts to all the existing business processes, all the existing infrastructure, where currently we have rather inflexible rules that don't quite work for everybody. It's not plurality, right? We can begin having a much more flexible administrative state using this. And of course you need guardrails, but that's the part I would really pay attention to, not the OpenAI. The fact that they're so visible means that everybody has eyes on them, and they will be constrained by that.
Could I just jump in and talk about AI agents, which I think was what they're trying to maybe get at in this question? Because you are able now to develop some kinds of low-level AI agents that can do things online. The questioner seems to say, well, what about like legal personhood for these these AI agents, and I would have, I'd be strongly against that. And we need to think of these technologies as tools, not as like quasi people. But it raises the issue about whether there's going to be sort of the capacity of the contemporary marketplace of ideas to sort of deal with synthetic media, not just synthetic media, but synthetic agents that will be polluting the marketplace of ideas. And this is something I've been working on quite a bit ever since we had this thing called the Kofi Annan Commission on Election and Democracy in the Digital Age. When we and for those who are interested, you can just go to my page at persily.com to download the report. And the problem is that if you think democracy requires some kind of deliberative capacity between human beings so they can evaluate the merits of arguments, the more that content is being produced by agents or by computational propaganda, the more that system breaks down. And I do worry that we are kind of there already. But this is why it's so important that the platforms where these public discussions happen have strong countermeasures against the use of bots, anonymous bots in particular.
I think I'd throw out one more thing, Robert, for this conversation about AGI. I think the important question here is about the purposes of tech development. So why is AGI in the conversation? It is because, as Sandy indicated, that OpenAI has said its goal is to achieve AGI. And I think that's where the conversation should be. Is that the right goal for the research capacity of these organizations? Might it be the case rather that the goal should be, how can we best advance these technological capacities of artificial intelligence in support of human flourishing? And if we ask that question, a subsidiary question from that might be, how can we best develop these tools in support of, for example, democracy, the stability and effective functioning of democracy? And I think you would see, just as Sandy said, rapid advances in technological capacity that in fact support human well-being. And I suppose I wonder, why is it that AGI is the desired goal as opposed to increased human well-being?
So I have a endowed chair that came from Marvin Minsky, and he was one of the people that came up with the phrase AI, right? And he said he did that because it was going to scare people and produce a lot of funding for research. So it's still scaring people, still producing a lot of funding for research. I want to mention one thing. One of the people from my group, Daz at Greenwood, worked with Wyoming on their legislation on DAOs, digital autonomous organizations. What that legislation specifies is you can have these sort of AI agents, but there has to be a human that carries the liability. There has to be somebody you can turn to for responsibility over what that AI does. Otherwise, it's against their enablement law.
Perfect. Thank you all for that. A very different question about kind of the tension between verifiability and protecting people whose voices we need to hear, but who, if we identify kind of the person behind the expression, they may experience doxing and violence. So do you see a tension between verification and fighting misinformation? And if so, how would we begin to address that tension?
So the technical thing, let me just jump in, is that the platform holds a secure, private verification that you are indeed a human, but then gives you a completely anonymous token that you use to carry out transactions. So you can say things, you can do things. Nobody will know who you are unless there's a court case that forces the company to release the basic documentation. And one of the people, Thomas Arjono, came up with the idea, you could do that as attorney-client privilege, where it has to be a very strong court case to be able to reveal the actual identity. One point is that you want to be able to do that for other reasons. I remember talking to the head of Orange, who had to violate French law in order to save a young girl who had been kidnapped. So it's illegal for him to find out the person and where they are, but she had been kidnapped and was in great danger. And so he violated the law to do this. There are cases where it's in the interest of the person to be able to get emergency services to them.
So I want to just spend a minute on this one as well, if you don't mind. It's a really important issue. In other words, it's technically possible, just as Sandy was describing, to protect anonymity for participation in the public sphere. But then that produces the all-important question of precisely who actually is maintaining that system of protection. In Sandy's comments there, it's corporations that are doing so. Others might make the case that it should be a sort of public sector responsibility. But either which way around, regardless of whether it's corporations or public sector, you have the problem of like, who's guarding the guardians, right? Either way, corporations or public sector, there's the capacity for abuse of that structure of protection of anonymity, or the moment where you actually do need to violate it for emergency purposes, as Sandy said, but then you also need guardrails against those sorts of emergency powers. So ultimately, what you then have is just a sort of, the reductio, the sort of problem of how you have fair, beneficent, non-authoritarian governance over these systems. For me, that does just bring everything back to the question of how we maintain sound democratic governance over the basic infrastructure of our technological world. And again, for me, that means how do we have healthy democracies? So I know I'm sort of, walking us in a circle here, but I don't want us to think that the solutions are purely technical. They're not. They depend on governance solutions. And so that means the hard challenge we have right now is how to ensure we do have governance systems that are rights protective, and that they're, and also not only rights protective, but effectively able to manage these kinds of infrastructures for the public good, for the public interest.
Nate, any thoughts on this? Otherwise, the hour has flown by. So maybe we can each do a final word, wrapping up. And I know there are unaddressed questions and topics, but maybe starting with you, Nate.
All right, I'll combine that with a final word, which is just that I think let me build on what Danielle was just saying about how many of the problems we are identifying as tech problems are really society problems and other sort of sociological problems, and that we are not going to tech our way out of our democracy problem right now, just as we didn't tech our way into it, even though I think technology can be an exacerbating factor on these sources of social division and lack of confidence. And so I think, we need an all hands on deck approach where government, civil society, academia, the platforms are all working to try to provide as healthy a democratic environment, because this election is a critical one. A lot depends on it. And I think the hope is that we can get through it with as little sort of scarring to our confidence in American democracy as possible.
Perfect. Thank you, Nate. And going in reverse order, Sandy, final thoughts.
Yeah, I've talked mostly about technical, but I 100% agree with what Danielle and Nate said. This is not a technical problem. Technical problems are ways of accomplishing societal goals. And this really is a question of how do we architect our government and our society to get the best trade-off between values. Because it's unlikely, in most cases, you can't have the values we have, like privacy and safety nets or public accountability. They come into conflict, and the question is, how do you trade it? And the point I have is that there's a great deal more flexibility in the tools we have on the tech side to implement these societal decisions than most people realize. Like, for instance, secure identity is not the same as, does not necessarily interfere with anonymity at all. And there are ways of having distributed systems where you have very few choke points for malevolent government or other actors. And so using that full suite of tools is where sort of my comment is aimed.
Thank you very much, Sandy. And Danielle, the final word.
I just want to say thank you for this conversation. I think everybody can probably tell that we're all thinking in real time here. And I think what has emerged so importantly from this conversation is the point of the nexus between questions of technical capacity and questions of governance. And the point of just how important it is to think about both of those things simultaneously and in relationship to each other.
Well, thank you all. This was fantastic. And I think Sarah will close us out.
Yeah, with that, I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to my co-organizers here. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this entire webinar series that we've done over the past academic year. And if you have any feedback, if there's any other topics you're interested in hearing about, we welcome your input, and feel free to send that over to myself or Shlomi or Robert or our team. Thank